riffs and occult imagery lies a treasure trove of bizarre tales that would make even horror writers blush. From drummers set ablaze for fun to finger prosthetics made from washing up bottles, the godfathers of heavy metal lived lives stranger than their darkest lyrics. These aren't your typical rock star anecdotes, they're jaw-dropping stories of industrial accidents, psychotic pranks, and supernatural encounters that shaped metal history. Here are the 15 weird facts you didn't know about Black Sabbath. Fact 1. Tony's fingertips were made from fairy liquid bottles. On his very last day working at a sheet metal factory in Birmingham, England, 17-year-old Tony Iommi suffered an accident that would forever change the sound of rock music. The teenager was filling in for a coworker who hadn't shown up, operating a guillotine press machine he'd never used before. As he pushed metal through the press, the machine came down on his hand, and when he quickly pulled back, the tips of his middle and ring fingers were severed completely. Doctors told Iommi he would never play guitar again, which devastated the young musician who had just been offered his first professional gig with a band heading to Europe. But instead of giving up, Iommi got creative with household items in a way that would make any do-it-yourself enthusiast proud. He took an empty fairy liquid washing up bottle from his kitchen and melted it down into a ball of plastic. Using a hot soldering iron, he carefully shaped the molten plastic into thimble-like caps that would fit over his damaged fingertips. The homemade prosthetics weren't comfortable or pretty, but they worked well enough to let him continue playing. Iommi wrapped the plastic fingertips with pieces of leather cut from an old jacket to give them better grip on the guitar strings. He also had to switch to lighter gauge strings, initially using banjo strings because guitar manufacturers didn't make light strings yet. The injury forced him to press down much harder on the strings since he couldn't feel them through the plastic, and bending strings became nearly impossible. These limitations led Iommi to tune his guitar down to lower pitches, which created the heavy, doom-laden sound that would define Black Sabbath and inspire countless metal bands. What started as a factory accident and a melted soap bottle became the foundation for an entirely new genre of music. Iommi still wears similar prosthetics today, more than 50 years later, proving that sometimes the most revolutionary innovations come from the most unexpected places. Fact 2. Bill Ward's beard inspired N.I.B., one of Black Sabbath's most iconic songs from their 1970 debut album, has a title that fans have debated for decades, but the real meaning is much simpler and sillier than anyone imagined. N.I.B. wasn't named after anything satanic or mystical, despite the dark themes in its lyrics about falling in love with a mortal woman. Instead, the title came from drummer Bill Ward's prominent facial hair, which became a constant source of amusement and inside jokes among his three bandmates. The letters N.I.B. stood for Nativity in Black, which was the band's playful nickname for Bill Ward's thick, dark beard that seemed to dominate his face. During their early days together, when the four young men from Birmingham were spending countless hours rehearsing and touring, Ward's impressive beard became a regular topic of conversation and gentle teasing. The other band members would make jokes about how his facial hair looked almost biblical in its fullness, leading them to come up with the tongue-in-cheek reference to a nativity scene. While Geezer Butler wrote the song's lyrics about love and temptation from the devil's perspective, Tony Iommi had already composed the memorable bass-heavy riff that would become the song's foundation. When it came time to give the track a name, the band decided to use their private joke about Ward's beard, rather than something that directly related to the song's actual content. This meant that one of heavy metal's most enduring classics was essentially named after a drummer's facial hair, turning an inside joke between friends into rock history. The fact that such a serious-sounding song title came from something as mundane as teasing a bandmate about his appearance shows how the young musicians were still just regular guys having fun together, even as they were creating music that would influence generations of metal bands. Ward himself seemed to take the ribbing in good humor, and the beard joke became part of Black Sabbath's early mythology, though most fans remained unaware of the true meaning for years. Fact 3. They spent more on cocaine than recording. When Black Sabbath entered the studio to record their fourth album in 1972, they ended up creating one of the most expensive drug habits in rock history. The band's cocaine consumption during the recording sessions for what would become Volume 4 cost them $75,000, which was actually $15,000 more than the $60,000 they spent on making the entire album. This mind-boggling financial breakdown shows just how out of control their substance use had become during what many consider their creative peak. The recording sessions took place at a rented mansion in Bel Air, California, where the band had set up a makeshift studio and were living while they worked on new material. Cocaine had become their drug of choice, and they were consuming it at such an alarming rate that mysterious unmarked vans would regularly arrive at the house to deliver fresh supplies packed in cardboard boxes. The band members later admitted they had no idea where all the drugs were coming from or who was organizing these deliveries, but the steady stream never seemed to stop. Bassist Geezer Butler later reflected on this period, saying that for him, this album represented one of Black Sabbath's best creative efforts, despite the chaos surrounding its creation. The band was so proud of their cocaine-fueled recording process that they originally wanted to name the album Snowblind, after their song celebrating their love affair with the drug. However, their record company refused to allow this title because cocaine was still considered too controversial for mainstream marketing, forcing them to settle on the more neutral Volume 4 instead. The irony wasn't lost on the band members that they were literally spending more money getting high than they were spending on creating music, but the drug use had become so normalized in their daily routine that it seemed like just another production expense. This period marked the height of Black Sabbath's substance abuse issues, which would eventually contribute to tensions that led to Ozzy Osbourne being fired from the band 7 years later. Fact 4. Ozzy painted himself purple and couldn't get it off. During one of Black Sabbath's most chaotic periods in the early 1970s, Ozzy Osbourne ended up wearing the consequences of a wild paint fight for several weeks in a way that nobody could have predicted. The band was staying at a luxurious rented mansion, likely the same Bel Air property where they recorded Volume 4, when they discovered rooms filled with various cans of paint and decided to have some fun during their downtime between recording sessions. What started as typical rockstar mischief quickly escalated into a full-scale paint war, with band members hurling different colors at each other throughout the house. In the heat of the moment, Ozzy grabbed a can of bright purple paint and enthusiastically covered himself from head to toe, thinking it would wash off easily once the fun was over. However, he soon discovered that this particular paint was much more permanent than he had anticipated, and no amount of scrubbing with soap and water could remove it from his skin. The purple paint proved to be especially stubborn on Ozzy's nose, where it had been applied most thickly during his enthusiastic self-painting session. Despite trying various cleaning methods and products, the bright purple color remained visible on his nose for weeks afterward, creating an embarrassing reminder of the paint fight every time he looked in a mirror. This meant that Ozzy had to conduct interviews, meet with record company executives, and perform on stage while sporting a distinctly purple-tinted nose that made him look like he had been in some kind of bizarre accident. The incident became another legendary story in Black Sabbath's collection of mansion-based mayhem, joining other tales of their destructive behavior while living in rented properties during their peak years. The homeowner who had rented them the mansion was reportedly shocked when they discovered Ozzy covered in rainbow hues from the paint fight, answering the door looking like he had been dipped in a kaleidoscope, which probably made explaining the security deposit situation quite interesting. Fact 5. They set Bill Ward on fire as a party piece. Black Sabbath guitarist Tony Iommi had developed what he called the band's party piece, which involved regularly setting drummer Bill Ward's thick beard on fire to entertain guests and impress people who visited their recording sessions. This dangerous form of entertainment became such a routine part of their social gatherings that Iommi would casually ask Ward if he wanted to be set on fire, and Ward would often agree to participate in what they treated as a normal part of their rock star lifestyle. The fire routine typically involved Iommi pouring rubbing alcohol over Ward's beard and then lighting it with a match or lighter, creating a brief but dramatic flame that would burn off quickly without causing serious harm. For months, this bizarre ritual worked exactly as planned, with the alcohol burning away harmlessly while providing the shocking spectacle that Iommi was looking for. The band treated it as harmless fun, and Ward seemed willing to be the center of attention during these fiery demonstrations. However, during one recording session in 1980, everything went terribly wrong when they decided to perform their party piece in front of producer Martin Birch, who had heard stories about Black Sabbath's supposed connections to Satanism and was already nervous about working with them. Instead of using the usual rubbing alcohol, Iommi grabbed a bottle of cleaning solution that studio technicians used to clean tape heads, not realizing that this chemical was much more flammable than what they normally used. When Iommi lit the solution that he had poured on Ward's clothing and beard, the drummer immediately went up in flames like a human torch, rolling on the floor and screaming in genuine pain while his bandmates initially thought it was all part of the act. The fire had soaked into Ward's polyester pants, which burned much more intensely than expected, leaving him with third-degree burns on his legs that required immediate hospitalization. Ward's mother later called Iommi to angrily tell him to grow up and warned that her son might lose his leg, finally putting an end to their dangerous party piece tradition. Fact 6. Almost called themselves blues band Margarine. Before becoming the legendary Black Sabbath, the four musicians from Birmingham went through several name changes that could have completely altered the course of heavy metal history, including one particularly unusual choice that involved a popular grocery store product. During their early days in 1968 and 1969, when they were still figuring out their musical direction and identity, the band seriously considered calling themselves Blues Band Margarine, as a play on the well-known supermarket spread called Blue Band Margarine. The idea for this quirky name came from the band's tendency to find inspiration in the most mundane, everyday items around them, much like how they had previously named themselves the Polka Tulk Blues Band, after spotting a tin of Polka Tulk talcum powder in Ozzy Osbourne's mother's bathroom. The young musicians seemed to have a pattern of looking at household products and consumer goods for creative inspiration when they were struggling to find a name that captured their evolving sound and image. Blue Band Margarine was a popular British brand that most people would have recognized from their local grocery stores, making it an oddly domestic choice for a band that was beginning to explore darker, heavier musical themes. The band members apparently thought it would be clever to twist the product name slightly by changing Blue Band to Blues Band, which would have at least given some indication of their musical style while maintaining the margarine reference that made the name memorable and unusual. Fortunately for the future of heavy metal, the band eventually abandoned this grocery-inspired naming approach and instead took their final name from a 1963 horror film starring Boris Karloff. The movie Black Sabbath was showing at a cinema across the street from their rehearsal space, and the band members realized that the ominous title perfectly captured the dark, frightening atmosphere they were trying to create with their music, leading them to make the choice that would define their legacy and influence countless metal bands for decades to come. Fact 7. Tony blew up Richard Branson's prize carp. Tony Iommi once turned a peaceful recording session into an explosive fishing disaster when he decided to use leftover pyrotechnics from a Black Sabbath tour to detonate Virgin Records founder Richard Branson's prized carp at his famous recording studio. The incident took place during the recording of Black Sabbath's 1983 album, Born Again, at the Manor Studios in Oxfordshire, which was owned by the billionaire entrepreneur who had built his fortune on Virgin Records and would later become known for his Virgin Atlantic airline and space tourism ventures. The Manor Studios was Branson's countryside retreat and recording facility, complete with beautiful grounds that included an ornamental pond stocked with expensive carp that the Virgin boss considered his pride and joy. These weren't ordinary fish from a local pet store, but rather valuable prize carp that Branson had carefully selected and maintained as part of his estate's landscaping. The peaceful pond setting was meant to provide a relaxing environment for musicians during their recording sessions, but Iommi had other plans for the aquatic residents. After a previous Black Sabbath tour had ended, Iommi apparently had some unused pyrotechnics and explosives left over from their stage show, and he decided that Branson's pond would make an interesting target for experimentation. Without asking permission or considering the consequences, the guitarist detonated the explosives in the water, creating a spectacular blast that killed Branson's beloved carp and probably traumatized any other wildlife in the immediate area. When Branson discovered what had happened to his prized fish, he was understandably furious about the destruction of his carefully maintained pond and the loss of his expensive carp. Iommi later recalled with typical dry British humor that he was not happy at all, which was probably a significant understatement considering that someone had just blown up a wealthy man's pet fish for no reason other than boredom and access to explosives. Fact 8. Geezer saw Satan in his bedroom. Geezer Butler's fascination with the occult came to an abrupt and terrifying end in 1968 when he claimed to have encountered a dark supernatural figure in his own bedroom, an experience that would completely change his relationship with black magic and directly inspire one of heavy metal's most iconic songs. Before this incident, the young bassist had been deeply interested in exploring Satanism and the supernatural, going so far as to paint his bedroom completely black and filling it with occult books and satanic paraphernalia, as he experimented with what he thought were harmless spiritual practices. Butler had been reading extensively about black magic and demonology, influenced by the horror novels of Dennis Wheatley and other writers who explored themes of supernatural evil and occult rituals. His interest wasn't necessarily about worshiping Satan, but rather came from curiosity about the spiritual world and a desire to understand the darker aspects of religious and mystical traditions that mainstream Christianity didn't address. However, his casual experimentation with occult practices took a dramatic turn when he woke up one night to find what he described as a dark, shadowy figure standing silently at the foot of his bed. The encounter was so frightening and realistic that Butler immediately abandoned his interest in the occult and threw away all of his satanic books and materials, convinced that he had somehow invited genuine evil into his life through his dabbling in black magic. The experience left such a powerful impression on him that he wrote the lyrics to Black Sabbath, based directly on this supernatural visitation, with the opening line, "What is this that stands before me?" describing exactly what he claimed to have seen that night. This terrifying bedroom encounter became the foundation for Black Sabbath's entire approach to horror-themed music, as Butler channeled his fear and fascination with the supernatural into lyrics that warned against the dangers of occult practices rather than celebrating them. The irony is that while many people assumed Black Sabbath promoted Satanism, the band's signature song was actually written as a cautionary tale about the very real spiritual dangers that Butler believed he had personally experienced. Fact 9. They painted Bill Ward gold and nearly killed him. During the recording of Volume 4 in 1972, Black Sabbath's dangerous pranking escalated to life-threatening levels when they discovered several cans of gold spray paint and decided to turn their unconscious drummer into a human statue. The band was staying at a luxurious Bel Air mansion owned by John DuPont, the heir to the DuPont Chemical Company fortune, and they had found multiple cans of high-quality gold DuPont paint stored in one of the garage rooms of the sprawling estate. After a particularly heavy night of drinking and drug use, Bill Ward had passed out completely naked and was lying unconscious when his three bandmates discovered him in this vulnerable state. Thinking it would be hilarious to surprise Ward when he woke up, Tony Iommi, Ozzy Osbourne, and Geezer Butler decided to cover their drummer from head to toe in the metallic gold paint, essentially turning him into a living Oscar statue while he slept off his intoxication. The prank seemed harmless enough at first, but Ward soon began experiencing violent convulsions and seizures as the thick layer of paint completely blocked all of his skin pores, preventing his body from breathing and regulating temperature properly. The bandmates initially thought Ward was just having a bad reaction to his hangover, but when his condition worsened rapidly, they realized something was seriously wrong and called for emergency medical help. When the ambulance crew arrived, they immediately recognized the severity of the situation and gave the band members a harsh lecture about how their prank could have easily killed their friend. The paramedics explained that covering someone's entire body in paint can be fatal because it prevents the skin from performing its essential functions of temperature regulation and toxin elimination. They had to use paint stripper and other harsh chemicals to remove all the gold paint from Ward's body, a painful process that left him looking bright red like a beetroot and required him to receive adrenaline injections to stabilize his condition. Fact 10. Ozzy recorded changes while naked and high. One of Black Sabbath's most emotional and vulnerable songs was created under circumstances that perfectly matched the raw, exposed feeling of the music itself, as the entire band recorded Changes while completely naked and heavily under the influence of drugs during the Volume 4 sessions in 1972. The tender ballad, which features Ozzy Osbourne singing about the pain of losing someone close to him over a simple piano melody, was captured during one of the band's most uninhibited and chemically enhanced studio sessions at their rented Bel Air mansion. The recording session took place during the height of Black Sabbath's cocaine and alcohol consumption period, when the band members were spending more money on drugs than on actually making their album, and were living in a constant state of intoxication that blurred the lines between creativity and chaos. The mansion where they had set up their makeshift recording studio had become a place where normal social conventions and clothing requirements had been completely abandoned in favor of whatever felt natural in the moment. According to band members who later recalled this particular recording session, all four musicians were not only heavily doped up on various substances, but had also stripped off all their clothes while working on the delicate piano-based track. The irony of creating such a heartfelt and emotionally honest song while in such a compromised physical and mental state wasn't lost on the band, but it somehow resulted in one of their most authentic and touching musical moments. The contrast between the gentle, almost fragile nature of Changes and the wild, drug-fueled circumstances under which it was recorded highlights the unpredictable creative process that characterized Black Sabbath's most productive period. While most bands might have struggled to capture genuine emotion while naked and high in a studio, Black Sabbath managed to create a song that would become one of their most beloved tracks, proving that inspiration can strike under even the most unusual and unconventional circumstances. Fact 11. There's a Brazilian "Where's Ozzy" game. A creative radio station in São Paulo, Brazil, took Ozzy Osbourne's reputation for outrageous behavior and turned it into an interactive puzzle game that cleverly referenced one of his most infamous moments in rock history. The Brazilian radio station created their own version of the popular "Where's Wally?" search and find game, but instead of looking for the familiar red and white striped character, listeners were challenged to locate Ozzy Osbourne hidden somewhere within a large, detailed cartoon illustration filled with various characters and objects. The game was called "Where's Ozzy Osbourne?" and featured a complex cartoon scene where fans had to carefully scan through all the visual details to spot the Black Sabbath frontman cleverly concealed among the artwork. What made this particular puzzle especially memorable and darkly humorous was the specific location where the illustrators chose to hide Ozzy within the busy cartoon landscape, which served as a not-so-subtle reference to one of his most notorious real-life incidents. The radio station's artists positioned cartoon Ozzy directly below a decapitated bird in the illustration, creating a visual joke that any rock music fan would immediately understand as a reference to the infamous 1981 incident when Ozzy bit the head off a live dove during a meeting with record company executives. This happened just seconds after he had signed his first solo recording contract following his departure from Black Sabbath, making it one of the most bizarrely timed publicity stunts in music history. The Brazilian game became popular among rock fans in South America, who appreciated both the challenge of finding Ozzy in the crowded illustration and the clever way the creators had incorporated his legendary bird beheading incident into the puzzle design. The placement of cartoon Ozzy near the headless bird showed that even years later, this single moment of shocking behavior had become so associated with his public image that it could be used as a visual clue to help people identify him in a crowd of cartoon characters. Fact 12. Tony wrote Armenia's Eurovision entry. Tony Iommi's musical career took an unexpected detour into international pop competition when he composed Armenia's entry for the 2013 Eurovision Song Contest, proving that the godfather of heavy metal could write in completely different musical styles when the situation called for it. The unlikely collaboration came about when representatives from Armenian public television reached out to the Black Sabbath guitarist after their country had failed to qualify for the finals in the previous year's Eurovision competition, and they were looking for a more internationally recognizable composer to help boost their chances. Armenia had good reason to approach Iommi specifically, as the guitarist had developed a special relationship with the country after helping to rebuild a music school that had been destroyed in an earthquake, making him beloved among Armenian music fans, who saw him as someone who genuinely cared about their cultural development. The 65-year-old musician agreed to write a ballad called Lonely Planet for the competition, which was a dramatic departure from the heavy, doom-laden riffs that had made him famous with Black Sabbath over the previous 4 decades. The song was performed by an Armenian rock band called Dorians during the Eurovision finals in Malmö, Sweden, and while it didn't win the competition, it managed to earn Armenia 41 points and a respectable 18th place finish out of the 26 countries that participated. Perhaps more satisfying for Iommi was the fact that his Eurovision entry actually outperformed Britain's official submission, which finished in 19th place with only 19 points, meaning that the British-born guitarist had managed to beat his home country while representing Armenia. The collaboration demonstrated Iommi's versatility as a composer and his willingness to experiment with musical styles far removed from the heavy metal sound that had defined his career. It also showed how his reputation had spread far beyond the rock and metal communities, reaching international television producers who recognized his songwriting abilities and thought his involvement might give their Eurovision entry the boost it needed to succeed on the European stage. Fact 13. Michael Bolton allegedly auditioned for the band. One of the most disputed and potentially fabricated stories in Black Sabbath history involves Tony Iommi's claim that smooth jazz and pop ballad singer Michael Bolton actually auditioned to become the band's new vocalist in 1982, when they were searching for someone to replace Ronnie James Dio after his departure from the group. According to Iommi's autobiography, the future soft rock superstar who would become famous for romantic hits like How Am I Supposed to Live Without You and When a Man Loves a Woman supposedly tried out for the position of fronting one of the heaviest and most influential metal bands in history. The timing of this alleged audition would have been particularly interesting from a career perspective, as Bolton was still several years away from achieving mainstream success and was working primarily as a songwriter for other artists during the early 1980s. If the audition actually took place, it would have represented a fascinating alternate timeline where one of the most gentle-voiced singers in popular music could have ended up screaming over Tony Iommi's crushing guitar riffs and Geezer Butler's thunderous bass lines. However, the truth of this story has been seriously questioned by other band members, particularly bassist Geezer Butler, who has suggested that Iommi simply made up the entire Michael Bolton audition as one of his typical jokes or tall tales that he enjoys telling to entertain interviewers and confuse music journalists. Butler has indicated that he believes Iommi concocted this particular story because he found it amusing to imagine how ridiculous it would sound for such a soft-voiced performer to audition for Black Sabbath. Michael Bolton himself has also weighed in on the controversy, firmly denying that he ever auditioned for Black Sabbath, and insisting that the entire story is nothing more than a rumor that has somehow taken on a life of its own over the decades. The band ultimately chose former Deep Purple vocalist Ian Gillan to replace Dio, which was certainly a more logical musical fit than Bolton would have been, regardless of whether the audition actually happened or remains just another piece of Black Sabbath mythology. Fact 14. Their debut album cost only $800 to record. Black Sabbath's revolutionary self-titled debut album, which essentially created the entire heavy metal genre and influenced countless musicians for decades to come, was recorded for the remarkably small sum of £800 during a single 12-hour session in February 1970. This bargain basement budget recording took place at Regent Sound Studios in London, where the four young musicians from Birmingham walked in with their instruments and walked out the same day with a completed album that would change the course of rock music forever. The band's approach to recording was refreshingly straightforward and practical, as they simply set up their equipment in the studio and played their songs live, capturing most of the tracks in just 1 or 2 takes, without the elaborate overdubbing and production techniques that were becoming common in rock music at the time. This raw, immediate recording method perfectly suited their heavy, unpolished sound and gave the album an authentic energy that more expensive and time-consuming recording sessions might have actually diminished. The £800 budget was so modest that it covered not only the studio time but also all the associated costs of making the record, including the services of producer Roger Bain, who would go on to work on several more Black Sabbath albums. To put this amount in perspective, £800 in 1970 would be equivalent to roughly £10,000 in today's money, which is still an incredibly small budget for recording an album that would sell millions of copies worldwide and spawn an entirely new musical genre. The speed and efficiency of the recording process reflected both the band's tight musical chemistry and their limited financial resources, as they simply couldn't afford to spend weeks in expensive studios perfecting every detail. Producer Roger Bain later added some atmospheric sound effects, including the famous thunder and rain sounds that open the album, but the core musical performances were captured during that single productive day, when 4 working-class musicians created heavy metal history on a shoestring budget. Fact 15. Geezer got his nickname from military slang. The man who wrote some of heavy metal's most dark and apocalyptic lyrics got his famous nickname through a surprisingly innocent chain of events that began with his older brother's military service and a bit of London street slang that eventually stuck for life. Terence Michael Joseph Butler, who would become known to the world simply as Geezer, acquired this unusual moniker during his childhood when his brother was serving in the British Army and was stationed alongside soldiers from London who spoke in thick Cockney accents. In Cockney slang, which is the distinctive dialect spoken by working-class people from London's East End, the word geezer is simply a casual way of saying man or fellow, similar to how Americans might use the word dude or guy when addressing someone. Young Terence's brother picked up this military slang during his time serving with these London soldiers and started using the word geezer when he came home on leave, calling his little brother Geezer in the same friendly, informal way that his army mates addressed each other. Terence found this new word fascinating and began incorporating it into his own vocabulary. But he took it a step further by calling everyone he met Geezer, whether they were schoolmates, neighbors, or anyone else he encountered in his daily life in Birmingham. This habit of greeting people with, "Hello, Geezer," or referring to his friends as Geezer, became so consistent and characteristic of young Terence that his classmates and friends eventually started calling him Geezer in return. The nickname became so deeply associated with his identity that by the time he joined his first bands and eventually became a founding member of Black Sabbath, nobody even thought of him by his real name anymore. The irony is that one of the most serious and intellectually minded members of Black Sabbath, who would write complex lyrics about war, religion, and social issues, got his stage name from what was essentially a casual greeting that his army brother had learned from some friendly soldiers in London decades earlier.